There is finally some good news from Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or rather the so-called Caliphate of the Islamic State, has finally come to an end. On 17th November 2017, the Iraqi army and its allies captured Raqqa, the last town held by ISIS in Iraq. And 2 days later, the Syrian army liberated Abu Kamal, also known as Al-Bukamal, the last ISIS stronghold in Syria. And Russia is spearheading talks about the post-ISIS scenario in Syria with the US, Iran, Turkey, and the Syrian government. In this video, we shall discuss the rise, the fall, and the final defeat of the so-called Caliphate, and what a post-ISIS scenario might look like, and what it means for the civil war in Syria. ISIS only came into the spotlight when the Syrian civil war was about 3 years old. Nevertheless, they soon captured international attention by their swift and sudden emergence. They placed a lot of emphasis on
presentation.
Burn you on the hills of death. Bring it on.
But the major reason for their widespread notoriety was that they had shocked the world by their gruesome tactics, atrocities, and crimes against humanity. ISIS started off as the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI, in 2006, which itself arose out of Al-QAEDA in Iraq after the death of its leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Iraq at that time was experiencing a sectarian insurgency in the aftermath of the US-led invasion. The invasion was launched under the false pretext that the dictatorial regime of Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction.
He develops weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. We thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't.
The violence that ensued killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and created sectarian tensions between the majority Shia Arab population and the minority Sunni Arabs. The Sunni Arabs paid the highest price for the de-Baathification policy of the United States, which disbanded Iraq's national army and dismissed all public sector employees with a connection to the Baath Party. This, combined with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's discriminative measures against the Sunni population, led to the radicalization of many Sunnis. The Islamic State of Iraq exploited these conditions to attract recruits to further escalate sectarian violence. The US troops withdrew from Iraq in December 2011, leaving behind an ill-equipped Iraqi National Army to fend for itself.
I said I'd end the war in Iraq. I ended it.
Oh, bummer. In 2013, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi announced the Islamic State of Iraq's expansion into Syria as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. The following year, ISIS swept through Iraq and Syria, seizing control of many major cities and towns. ISIS rebranded itself as the Islamic State, a caliphate, with al-Baghdadi as the caliph in June 2014. So, how big and strong was this caliphate? At its peak, it's known to have controlled an area the size of Britain. But that also included a large desert area that really didn't belong to anyone. A more realistic estimate is around 90,000 to 100,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of South Korea. ISIS held major cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown, Raqqa, which served as their capital, and the city of Palmyra. But the largest city under ISIS was Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. ISIS persecuted the religious and ethnic minorities like the Assyrian Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen, Kurds, and the Shabak. ISIS showed no tolerance to ancient artifacts and monuments. These were symbols of idolatry according to their extreme interpretation of Salafism, which itself is an ultra-orthodox version of Sunni Islam. Thankfully, the so-called caliphate did not last. And with no allies in sight apart from minor militias, it was never guaranteed to last. ISIS faced unanimous opposition from all the major players in the Syrian civil war and the Iraqi conflict. Rivals made temporary alliances just to defeat ISIS. Even the Al-Nusra Front, which is the armed wing of Al-QAEDA, fought ISIS. In the period between 2014 to 2015, success against ISIS was pretty hard to come by. The Syrian government forces and the rebels were busy fighting each other, and the US, under the Obama administration, was pursuing a $500 million plan to identify and arm 5,000 moderate rebels to fight ISIS. That plan was a total disaster. Instead of 5,000, they only managed to train 54 people. 30 of them were either captured or killed by al-Nusra, and it reached this situation a few weeks later.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five. So.
As I see it right now, this 4 or 5 U.S. trained fighters, let's not kid ourselves, that's a joke.
So as a result, the US finally started aiding the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a multi-ethnic alliance led by the Kurdish YPG, and that led to many victories against ISIS. Donald Trump at the time was very vocal in his support for the Kurds.
First of all, the Kurds have to be brought into it because they're good fighters and we treat them terribly. Or I would take away their source of wealth. You will defeat ISIS. They are very wealthy. They're building a hotel in Syria. A hotel. They're competing with me. They're building a hotel.
Yes, definitely a major concern that requires immediate action. Anyway, he stuck to his word and directly armed the SDF in 2016 in the battle to drive ISIS out of their capital in Raqqa. And they succeeded. We may not always agree with Donald Trump, but credit where credit is due. The Syrian army, bolstered by the Russian intervention in Syria, retook the provinces of Hama and Homs and liberated the cities of Palmyra and Deir ez-Zor in 2017. Oh yes, and the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army expelled ISIS from the area between the cities of Azaz and Jarablus near the Turkish border. But that's a whole different story for another episode. In Iraq, the National Army retook Tikrit, Ramadi and Fallujah, and finally Mosul with the aid of American airstrikes and the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an alliance of Shia militias backed by Iran. Sinjar was liberated by the Kurdish Peshmerga with help from Kurdish forces from across the border. In the final stages of the war on ISIS, Iraqi forces liberated the border town of Al-Qaim and crossed into Syria to aid the Syrian forces in liberating the town of Abu Kamal. So, is there any territory that ISIS still controls? The grey area that you see is basically desert, which no one controls. We would have to zoom in to see what little area ISIS still controls. All that remains of ISIS are these little towns and villages in Deir ez-Zor, Hama, and down south in Daraa. Probably by the time you watch this video, these places would have already been liberated. ISIS, however, remains as an ideology and as a terrorist organization, just like Al-QAEDA. On November 13, the BBC revealed a secret deal between ISIS, the US-led coalition, and the SDF to transport ISIS fighters and their families out of the city of Raqqa and into Turkey. The coalition's explanation was that it was the decision of the people of Syria to do so as a form of truce. What happens now when these battle-hardened fighters return to their native countries? Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau rather bizarrely suggested reintegrating returning ISIS fighters. Justin, that Trudeau? Well, both ISIS and Trudeau share something in common: a vested interest in paradise. Anyway, the peculiar characteristic of ISIS is that just about anyone can pledge allegiance to it and carry out terrorist activities in its name, even if they have zero connection to the organization or its members. A teenager in the UK was found guilty of planning an ISIS-inspired attack on a Justin Bieber concert. He had a suicide note which talked about running down non-believers. Or did he actually mean non-believers? You can see he was in two minds. Well, ISIS is more than happy to claim responsibility for any of these attacks, even for the ones that were not carried out in their name. Lately, things haven't been working out so well for them. ISIS also has a military presence in countries such as Libya, Nigeria, Egypt, Yemen, Afghanistan, and the Philippines. Again, most of these groups are local militias that pledge their allegiance to ISIS. Some leaders are taking no chances.
I want them dead.
In Iraq today, where it all started, there is widespread distrust among the various religious and ethnic communities who remain scarred by their experience under ISIS. The senior US commander in Iraq warned that the Iraqi government had to reach out and reconcile with the Sunni population in order to prevent an ISIS 2.0 from emerging. They could have used another term though. In a positive sign, Sunni tribes joined Iraqi government forces in the fight that liberated the town of Raqqa. There is also the challenge of rehabilitating the civilians, especially the children brainwashed by ISIS. And finally, even though ISIS has been defeated, the Syrian civil war hasn't yet come to an end. The remaining parties are the Syrian government and the Syrian Democratic Forces, who now precariously border each other, the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, and a number of militant groups, most of which are of jihadist origin and are for some reason referred to as just rebels or opposition groups. Al-NUSRA, Al-QAEDA's military wing, now known as Tahrir al-Sham, is the most prominent among these jihadist groups. Nevertheless, things are looking better, with major powers now focusing on discussion and cooperation rather than on damaging rhetoric. Russia is playing the leading role in mediations. On November 21, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. On November 23, Putin hosted Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Putin made sure that US President Donald Trump was being kept updated about the developments. Trump has always been in favor of cooperation with Russia to resolve the Syrian crisis.
I'd get everybody together. That includes Russia, and I've been right about that too. Now all of a sudden Putin's going wild with bombing ISIS, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Who needs to take the credit? Let him have some credit. But I look at Assad, and Assad to me looks better than the other side.
He has continued that stance of closer ties with Russia into his presidency. As far as solving the crisis is concerned, cooperation between all the major powers involved is crucial, as Syria cannot afford another escalation in violence. The people always pay the biggest price. For the sake of the people of Syria, we hope that the peace processes like the Astana and the Geneva talks bear fruit. Wonder what Hollywood is thinking looking at all this. Time for another
One last ride.
Fast and the Furious. Sorry Hollywood, but Bollywood just beat you to that. Just look at Salman Khan single-handedly taking on ISIS. It looks like it's on Player 2 mode. Bollywood, why is your ISIS red? Well, I guess it's better than Hollywood's white ISIS. If you enjoyed this video, please share it and give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.